The queue feature has existed with prior releases of Microsoft Dynamics CRM, but some new enhancements are introduced with this release. One of the enhancements is the concept of a private queue. A private queue can be used to limit its visibility. With a private queue, you can define which users should have visibility to the queue. This will help simplify the list of queues that appear for support reps. The queue list shown here displays public queues as well as any private queues you're a member of. If you're not a member of a private queue, it will not appear in this list. In the screenshot shown here, the user is not a member of the private queue named escalation queue, so it does not appear in the list. Although a private queue does not appear if you're not a member, you can add cases to the queue. When you select a case and click Add to Queue, the public and private business queues will appear. Let's take a quick look at how you can create a new queue and set it as private. So within Service Management, I see an option here for queues. I can see I have some existing queues, but I'm going to create a new one. You'll notice that if you've worked with a queue form before, this has been updated as part of this release when you installed the latest product updates and enabled the new features. You'll see that there was a previous form called Information, so if you'd made any customizations to that, you could locate them on that form. Here though, I'm going to just give this a name. I'll call this my Premier Queue. And there's a new field here called Type, where I can choose either between public or private. If I choose private, a subgrid appears for members, and once I click Save, I'll be able to choose which members to add to this queue. By default, it set me as the owner and automatically added me as one of the members to this queue. I can add additional members by clicking the plus button here. I can choose any of them from the drop-down list, so I could just choose an individual person like that, or I could click the lookup, scroll down and choose Look Up More Records. I could select one or multiple from here and add it. The other option is I can choose an entire team if I want to. So either here I can see the list of teams that I can choose from, or when I'm doing Look Up More Records, there is an option to switch to teams. So I'm going to choose the Escalation Engineers team. And what that does is it takes whoever is a member of that team at that time and it automatically adds them as members to this queue. So one thing to be aware of though is that this is a one-time thing. That was just a shortcut for adding those users that are currently members of that team. So this is not keeping a reference between this queue and that team, or if I later went and modified the membership of that team, it does not remove or add members to this queue. So that is one thing to be aware of, that this does work slightly differently for these custom queues compared to the automatically created queues for teams, where when you change membership of the team, it does change membership of those automatically created queues for teams. So that's one distinction to be aware of. So I'm going to click Save. I'm going to switch to the service area. And from within service, I'm going to go to queues. You'll see that by default, I'm in here in the queues I'm a member of option, and it's showing me all then the different private queues that I'm a member of. I can switch this to other filters such as the All Public Queues view or All Queues. Also, this list, as mentioned before, is filtered based off of only the views that I'm either a member of or that are public queues. So there was that escalation queue that I'm not a member of, so it doesn't appear in this list. So if your business has a lot of different queues, this can really simplify the list that appears for users and allow them to focus on the queues that really make sense for them to see. So as I mentioned, that escalation queue does not appear here because it's a private queue and I'm not a member. So one thing that is nice though is that as long as I have permissions in my role, I could still choose to route a case to that queue. So maybe I'm on a frontline team, but I want to escalate this to the next level. I could choose to route this to that queue if I need to. So here, I'm going to choose queue, and I'm going to click this lookup, and this is going to show me the queue lookup. So this is one place you see the queue lookup, but there's other places in CRM where the queue lookup appears. And one thing that's changed is that in prior releases, there was a feature that was added to be able to automatically create a queue for any team or user, also for the organization itself. So what would happen is that maybe you only had a couple queues that you were really using for your business, but there was a bunch of automatically created queues such as users and teams. So let's say you only had 6 queues like this, but you had 1,000 users, you would have seen 1,006 queues in this list. The ones that were automatically created might have had brackets around them by default, so you could help differentiate them a little bit, but it was just a huge list that you had to sort through to find the queue you wanted. Now by default, this queue lookup is filtered to only show queues that are not automatically created. If I do need to get to one of those queues that was automatically created for a user or a team, I can switch the filter here to show all queues. So here you can see that there's different user queues that are in this list. Those are ones that were automatically created. Those are filtered out by default now. So you've seen how the private queue feature, along with some of the new filtering enhancements, simplifies the experience for your support reps. One of the things we haven't talked about yet is that there's also been some addition of different columns to the case and queue views. So as you can see in this screenshot, this is one of the default queue views that has been modified to include some additional columns. One of those columns is response by and another one is resolve by. Both of those fields are related to the new SLA functionality. So if you're using SLA, being able to see that data helps the engineer understand which case should be taken next to be able to meet the next SLA that's required. So I've switched over to the application to show you that there are some of these default queue views that do include additional columns such as response by and resolve by. One thing to be aware of is that the views I'm looking at here are queue views. So queues can show things like activities or cases. It also can show columns from the related objects such as the case here. So you can notice that each of these different columns says case after it within parentheses. That's an indicator that that's a column being displayed from the case entity, but all these records I'm looking at here are really queue item records. So one limitation with looking at a view in CRM is that if columns are being retrieved from some other entity, you can't sort based off of it. So you can see I can't sort based off any of these columns, but any of these columns that are part of the queue item record, I can sort based off of. So I wanted to point that out, but I also wanted to show that these same columns were added to some of the default case views as well. And since those are fields that are on the case entity, I can sort based off those columns from the cases area. One thing to be aware of is that a number of these default views were modified. If you had made any modifications to those views before you updated, those customizations that you made will not be lost, but any of these additional columns won't automatically be added to your customized views. However, you could choose to add these columns to your views if you want to, or if for some reason you're not using the SLA functionality, you could remove those from any of the default queues where they were added. So in relation to looking at places where additional columns have been added, one other helpful location where columns have been added is when you're looking at a list of queues. So here within Service Management in the queues area, I see all my different queues. Two different columns have been introduced, one for queue items and number of members. Also the type column is displayed here too, so I can identify which of these queues are private and which are public. For the ones that are private, I see the number of users that are member of that queue. Also, I can see the number of items that are in that queue. So this can help me quickly identify if there's any queues that are overloaded or maybe queues that are understaffed. So I could look at this and maybe see that there's 19 queue items here. I might need to look at rerouting some of that work to additional queues or increasing the staffing for that queue. If you're wondering where this is stored, this is actually not physically stored as numbers in SQL. It is retrieving that dynamically each time that you pull up this list. The final topic we'll discuss in relation to queue enhancements are the different commands that are available when you're working with queue items. So if you're looking at a list of queue items, the command bar would appear and you had different options that were available. Besides the icons changing, some of the names and functionality have changed. So for example, in prior releases, route was named routing, pick was called work on, and release and remove had the same name, but the different dialogues that appear when you're using these commands have changed slightly. So it provides a simplified experience. You can refer to the documentation for the exact details of how it worked before and how it works now, but it is definitely a simplified experience. Another new feature in this release is routing rules. Routing rules allow you to define rules that route cases to queues, users, or teams based on certain conditions. For example, you can have a rule configured to automatically route cases from your Premier customers to your Premier queue. When you're creating routing rules, you simply define the conditions and then choose where to route the case. Although there are other types of entities like activities that can be assigned to queues, the routing rules feature is currently limited to the case entity. So when you create a routing rule, it's important to understand that you can only have one routing rule set that's active. So the routing rule set is basically the parent of all the routing rule items that are within that routing rule set. So here you can see within this support routing rule set, there are 3 different rule items, And each of those different items can have a different condition, and when that condition is met, it can assign it to a specific queue, user, or team. For each rule item within a routing rule set, you provide a name for that rule item, define the different conditions, and then choose whether you want to route it to a queue or a user or team, and then you select that appropriate object. So within a routing rule set, you could have one or multiple rule items, and the order of these items does matter. When a routing rule set gets applied to a case, it's going to evaluate the different conditions based off the order they're in this list. So for example, this one has the escalated cases rule item first. It would look at the condition for that item, see if it applies. If it does, it would route it to that specific queue. If it didn't meet that condition, it would evaluate the next one until that condition is met. Once it meets a condition, it'll apply that rule and won't continue on. So you can select the item here and change the order using the up and down arrows. The last topic we'll discuss is how the routing rules get applied. It depends on how the case is created. If you automatically get a case created either through workflow or the automatic case creation rules, it'll automatically apply that active routing rule set. If you're just creating a case manually through the web client or Outlook client, it won't automatically apply that rule. So in that case, you can select one or multiple cases, and you can choose this apply routing rule, and that's also available from within the form of a case. I'm going to do a quick demonstration of how to create a new routing rule set. So first, within Service Management, I'll click Routing Rule Sets. Then I'll click New to create a new one. Provide a name. And you'll notice that Rule Items is disabled until I save the record. The next thing I need to do is add one or more rule items. So I'll click plus. I'll provide a name. Then I need to define the condition. Then for the scenario where this condition is met, I need to choose which queue, user, or team I want to assign it to. I'm going to click Save and New. I'm going to create one more. I'm going to create one final rule item as a fallback. So right now I have one for escalated cases, one for high priority cases, but for any that don't meet that condition, I want to have one more to fall back to. So for that, I'm not going to define any if conditions. I'm going to choose to assign that to my level 1 support team. Choose Save and Close. And then an important part is I need to make sure I activate this. And again, you can only have one active routing rule set. One thing I didn't show before activating this routing rule set is that you can control the order of these rule items, and the order does matter. So if this wasn't already active, I would see different up and down arrows here where I could change the order of these items. So the way this works is that when a routing rule set gets applied to a case, it's going to evaluate the different rule items in the order they're listed here. So it would first look at this first rule item to see if the case is escalated. If it's not, it would move on to evaluating that next condition. And if that case priority was high, it would route it to level 2 support. And once it found one that met the condition, it would process it, assign it to that queue, and stop processing any additional rule items. So I'm going to now switch over to the service area and test applying this to a case record. So here I'm going to choose one or multiple cases, and you'll see there's an option for Apply Routing Rule. So again, if these cases were created automatically, either through email to case creation or through workflow, it would have automatically applied that rule. But if I just had maybe created some of these cases manually, I might want to apply this routing rule in certain conditions. For this specific case, this one has the priority set to high. And if I went and looked at this specific case, I would see that the is escalated is not set to true, so it would cause it to not meet that condition in that first rule item. But because the priority is high, it's going to meet that condition in the second one. So when I choose to route this, it should route it to that level 2 support queue. I'll switch over to the queues area. I'll change my filter to show level 2 support. And now after refreshing, you can see that that queue item is showing up there. One thing to be aware of is that this does use workflow behind the scenes similar to the SLA functionality. So it might take a second to appear here.